Shalom, this is Rabbi Klein from the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. Imagine it's Simchas Torah right now, and you are called for the last Aliyah of the year, the one when we read the end of the book of Deuteronomy, called the Chatan Torah, the groom of the Torah. Now you get up there to say your blessing, and then all of a sudden you look through the side of your eyes, and you see the Torah crown, that silver Torah crown sitting there, the one that was adorning the Torah scrolls, and you thought it might be funny to put this crown on your head. What do you think the rabbi of that synagogue would do? I think they'd be rather upset, don't you think? Well, this absurd story actually really happened over 1,000 years ago in the 10th century. We actually have one of the responsa from one of the last great Gaonim, Rabbi Hai Gaon in Egypt in the 10th century. And he says that every year the congregation created a special crown, especially for Simchat Torah, and that was placed on the head, on the Torah, and then placed on the head of the Chatan Torah, the person that had the last Aliyah. Now, this custom has a long history, and later authorities objected to this custom. In fact, Rav Hai Gaon himself was upset with this. He said, Malin b'kodesh ve'eno maridim, which means you should always go up in holiness and not down in holiness. How can you have something that adorned the Torah now adorning a person? Even in the 13th century in Provence, the Rashba mentions that while he doesn't like this custom at all, it was so widespread that he said we shouldn't object. What's the meaning of this crazy act? What were the people thinking over 1,000 years ago? In fact, I'm going to ask all of you a bigger question. Why decorate people a Torah scroll with a crown at all in the first place? Indeed, is the crown a religious symbol? It's a political symbol. Similarly, the breastplate that we put on many Torahs, called a choshen, or a tas in Yiddish, is in fact a priestly symbol. So we're taking different types of clothing and we are adorning our Torahs, which seems very strange. To answer the question, I think we need to look no further than in this week's Parsha. In this week's Parsha, we talk about the fashioning of the different objects that were put into the tabernacle and later into the Beit HaMikdash, the temple in Jerusalem, at least the first temple. And in the actual Mishkan, the tabernacle itself, there were various objects that were fashioned from pure gold. Besides the menorah, there were 3 other objects that were fashioned. One was the shulchan, the showbread table. The second one was the Mizbach HaKetoret, the incense altar, and the third, of course, is the Aron, the ark. Among the 3 objects, all of them have a similarly decorative border that surrounds all of them. In Hebrew, it's called a zer zahav, a decorative border of pure gold. And so there's an indication that all of these 3 objects are connected because they all have this decorative border. Now, in the Midrash, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says that actually this decorative border, or these around the objects, are actually 3 crowns: the crown of kingship, the crown of priesthood, and the crown of Torah. In essence, there are really 3 sources of authority that God grants in this world. Let's look first at the showbread table. The table had loaves of bread that were cooked every week and put on those tables. This represents the physical, the secular, represents the idea of political authority and kingship. That is the crown he calls of kingship. And then you have the incense table where the incense altar, every day the incense was brought, and this was a role of the priest. So this represents the cultic authority of the priest. It's the crown of priesthood. Now, both of these institutions, the kingship and the priesthood, actually are hierarchical. They're hereditary institutions. You know, there's this joke that a person wants the first aliyah, the aliyah of Cohen on Shabbat, and the rabbi says, well, you can't have it. He says, I want it. I'll give you money. He says, you still can't have it. He gives 1,000, 2,000. The rabbi won't let him have it. Finally, he says, why is this so important to you? He says, because my father was a Cohen, my grandfather was a Cohen, my great-grandfather was a Cohen. The joke is that, of course, to be a Cohen, you can't want to be a Cohen. It's hereditary. And so these 2 institutions, kingship and priesthood are both hereditary sources of authority and are hierarchical. However, during the Second Temple, there was a new center of authority that arose, one upon which contemporary Jewry today is based, and that's the rise of rabbinic Jewry. There's a third center of authority, prophetic authority, and the rabbis actually see themselves as inheriting that tradition. In fact, who's the greatest prophet in Jewish history? Moses. Who's the greatest rabbi in Jewish history? Moses. That's why in Hebrew we call him Moshe Rabbeinu. Both are brought together. And this third crown is the crown of Torah. And that is symbolized by the ark, the ark that was always placed in the inner sanctum. It says by the other two crowns, or the other two decorative borders, Vasita lo, you should make for it. But by the ark it says Vasita alav, you shall make upon it. But there's a play on words that the Midrash says. It says mi'ulam mikulam. It is elevated among all the other ones. It's more important than the other two. And in fact, we have the spatial idea. The shulchan, the table, and the incense altar were placed in the antechamber of the tabernacle, while the ark was placed in the inner sanctum of the tabernacle, pointing out that the most important crown of all is the crown of Torah. Thus, we have a political icon, a crown of a Torah, a political icon being reappropriated to teach a new hierarchy. The highest level of authority in the Jewish community is the Torah scholar, the one who gains wisdom and insight, the one who attains spiritual insight into this world. To whom is this crown available? Is it hierarchical? As we mentioned, with the priest, you can become a priest only if your father is a priest. With the king, only if your father was a king. However, the rabbis point out something so important. The Torah is available to anyone for the taking. It's radically egalitarian. It's munach lakol, the Rambam says. The crown of the Torah, it lies ready within the grasp of all Israel. And what's the verse that Maimonides brings to prove this? Torah tziva lanu Moshe, morasha kilat Yaakov. The Torah is given to all of us. Moses commanded all of us, and it is an inheritance to all of us. Whoever wants it can go ahead and take the crown. And in fact, the Shulchan Aruch tells us there are two verses that a child should learn at the very beginning when they first start to speak. Of course, one is the Shema. But what's the second verse? Torah tziva lanu Moshe, morasha kilat Yaakov. That the Torah is available to anybody who wants it. Now, of course, the study of Torah is not an easy path. The Rambam talks about that you need a lot of sacrifice to attain Torah and wisdom, to attain this crown, but it's available to anyone. And today, clearly, whether you're a man or a woman, it is available to anyone for the taking. Consider the age that we live in today. How much easier it is. Torah can be studied in groups. It can be studied in synagogues. It can be studied online. Think about the proliferation of day schools and Hebrew schools where people can study now. That was not available in previous generations. Think about the thousands and thousands of books and online literature and podcasts. Indeed, we're living in an age where Torah study is much easier to access. You don't need to go to a far town to study by a scholar. You can study from wherever you sit. Think about also our lives as American Jews. We have higher educations. We all study in college, or most of us, and some of us go for graduate degrees. Should we not have the same thing Jewishly? Should we not have advanced Jewish education? The Jewish literacy that we learned for our bar or bat mitzvah is not going to be able to carry us out throughout our lives. We need to be constant learners, deepening our understanding, deepening our affiliation, deepening our understanding, becoming more literate Jews. You know, we say it when we finish a tractate of Talmud. There's a word that we say, Hadran Alach. Hadran Alach is generally translated as, we are going to return to you. So if you finish the first tractate of the Talmud, Brachot, you'd say, Hadran Alach Mesechet Brachot. I'm going to return and review you Brachot. However, Rabbi Chaim ben Betzalel, the brother of the Maharal of Prague, says something else. The word Hadar doesn't mean only to return. It also means beauty, or glory. This is also a term that's used with kings. And so the word Hadran Allah is to say, our glory is from you, God, meaning through the study of our Torah, some of your spiritual glory from above, God, comes down unto us. So the first, when we finish a tractate of Talmud, we're saying we are sharing in the spiritual richness of your Torah, God. Now let's return to that original act of the Chatan Torah, the person that had the Aliyah at the last Aliyah on Simchat Torah. What did that mean by him putting the crown on his head? Now, we don't really know what the common people meant or were thinking. However, I would posit that we should look at this act as a dramatic reenactment of the very ideas we're speaking of, that the crown of Torah is available to anyone, and the person concluding that Torah is reenacting it by taking the Torah crown and putting it on his own head. The one that's going up to read the final part of the Torah is putting the crown on his head as if to say to everyone around that this crown that I'm wearing is available to all of you as well. Let's all try to claim that crown for ourselves, the Shabbat, the crown of Torah. Wishing all of you Shabbat Shalom.